I picked up this Spectraply blank at Woodcraft the other day. It's a birch veneer core plywood where every ply is dyed a different color, and they sell it in all different kinds of combinations of colors. I've seen these before used for gun stocks and knife handles, pepper grinders, duck calls. I thought that it would be interesting to try it in a segmented bowl. I'm using this light colored cherry to try and offset the boldness of the colors in the Spectraply. I'm doing rings with 12 segments, but when I did some sketches I realized that with a 12 segment ring I wouldn't be intersecting very many of the plies in each segment when I turned it around. So I decided to do a 6 segment ring with the Spectraply. I had to be very delicate about how I cut up the Spectraply blank because it wasn't very big, so I drew it up in SketchUp to make sure it would work. The bottom of the bowl is a solid piece of cherry. I glued up some scrap wood as a waste block, mounted this to a faceplate, turned the tin in, and then mounted it to the chuck to get the bottom round. I cut most of the segments using the table saw with a miter gauge. I used a stop block clamped to the fence to make sure each segment was the same size for each ring. This really wasn't very accurate, and I had to make some adjustments later to fix the inaccuracies. I tried to cut up the Spectraply on the bandsaw, but my blade is really dull, and this stuff is actually really hard. I got all the way through it after I took the fence off and just followed the line by hand. I did such a bad job resawing this stuff that I had to plane the pieces down to make sure they would register correctly on the miter saw guide. I was using the miter saw now to cut the segments, just because I got a more consistent angle. I should have rechecked my design since the tolerances were so tight on the size of the segments already, but I forged ahead. This stuff is like the glitter of woodworking, so if you're going to try using it, I highly recommend good dust management. I have blue stuff all over the shop now. I can't get rid of it. I sanded all the fuzzy edges off the segments. I'm using a homemade disc sander that's made from some scrap of plywood mounted to a faceplate on the lathe. I really need to build a table for this because it can be pretty difficult to hold the pieces perpendicular to the disc when you're sanding. The dust collector is essential here because this creates a lot of dust. I glued up the rings on my dining room table. If I'm not in a hurry, I like to put a thin layer of glue on the ends of each segment and let it dry. I just don't feel comfortable having a structure composed solely of 12 ingrained butt joints. I've never seen anyone else do this though, so I'm probably just being a little bit conservative. I don't have a thickness sander, so every ring that I glue onto the bowl I have to turn and sand the top face to get it perfectly flat. I like to have at least 4 hours of dry time on the glue before I even want to mount something to the lathe, so this can turn into a pretty slow process. Normally, every day after work, I sand one face of the ring on the disc sander. Then I put the bowl with the last ring on the lathe and turn it flat so that I can glue the next ring on top. And then while that's drying, I glue up the segments to make the next ring. And I just continue this process until there are no more rings to put on the bowl. I ran into some trouble on the Spectraply ring when I realized that after all the thickness planing I did on the segments, they were just too thin. I drew the largest circle that I could inscribe in the hexagon, and I only had just over a 1/4 inch of thickness at the vertices of the inside perimeter of the ring. I was cutting off the outside corner so it would be a little bit easier to turn when I realized that I would be able to salvage a little more thickness by gluing these pieces into the inside corners. I was really happy at how well this worked. I make a lot of mistakes in the shop, but rarely do I come to solutions that are this elegant. I'm sure that this has been done before, but I was really proud of myself for the quick thinking. I try to do the rough turning on the bowl as I glue it up, and this is just to keep everything in balance, and also because it's easier to do the hollowing when the bowl is shallow than the full depth. This bowl is about 11 inches in diameter, and you can see that it's really pushing the limits of my lathe, both in size and the demand on the motor. I was thrilled to see the Spectraply after turning it around. I hadn't been able quite to wrap my head around what it would look like. The patterns were really nice arches of color on the inside and outside, but I didn't really like how the top looked. It was just too busy, so I decided to add another ring of cherry to hide the ingrain of the plywood and kind of tie the whole bowl together. I did some tests on scraps of Spectraply because I noticed that the colors would run a little bit when I was gluing. This one on the left, I put water on the wood, and you can see that the dye is water soluble. The other two are mineral spirits and tung oil, and the colors didn't run at all with these two, so I knew I had to use oil-based finish on this bowl. Before I did the bottom, the bowl got sanded all the way up through the grits on the inside and the outside. I'm using a drill to keep the sandpaper moving so I'm not always sanding in one direction. I had to make some custom jaws for my jug to hold the rim of the bowl so I could turn the bottom. Again, I'm pushing the limits of my equipment's capabilities here, but luckily this worked just fine. I turned the waste block off the bottom and then cut in a bit in the center to make sure the bowl would sit on the edges of the foot. And here it's done. I'm sanding the bottom with my soldering iron, and this actually worked really well. And here it is. I'm quite proud of how it turned out, especially since this is my second bowl ever to turn on the lathe. I really appreciate you taking your time to watch this video. It's the first one I've ever made, so if you like it, please let me know in the comments. And if you're interested in seeing more videos like this, you can subscribe to my channel. I won't make any promises about when the next video will be, but I've got some really interesting ideas after seeing how this turned out, and I'm excited to try them out.